This is the first part of the 3-part coffee table series. First step was seeing what bottle caps I have. I've been collecting them for years, intending to use them in some project, and just now finally getting around to it. So I needed to see what I had and start getting an idea of what colors were available. My first thought was to set up all these little plastic cups and kind of organize things in a color wheel. I could group all the different bottle caps by their approximate color and get a better feel for what I had. Pretty soon I realized that the colors weren't as diverse as I expected, so a color wheel didn't make as much sense. I had a whole lot of extra blackish bottle caps and a whole lot of copper-ish ones, but not so many of certain other colors like white. Eventually I had boxes for the black and copper caps and cups for each of the other major colors, and I could clean up the extra bottle caps I didn't think I'd need. With the colors sorted, I needed to figure out approximately how big of a surface area I'd have. So I took a quarter sheet of 1/2-inch thick plywood and used an ancient woodworking technique. Okay, Google, what is 24 times the golden ratio? Once I had decided on the measurements, I cut off the extra with a circular saw. I thought the tabletop that would have the bottle caps on it would look best if it were black, but I didn't want a flat black, so I just went with an ebony stain. I cut down some scrap 2x4s to use for the legs. I just made them approximately square with the goal of tapering them later. For the frame, I used a scrap 2x6. It wasn't the best piece of wood. I decided I'd use mortise and tenon joins for the frame of the table, so I cut the mortises on the router table and did them in the approximate center, realizing afterwards that they would sort of touch, so that wasn't quite ideal, but I could just kind of cut off the corner of the tenons to make that work. So once those mortises were ready, I just took a chisel to them and made sure to flatten them out. Then I could mark the tenons and also mark approximately how deep they needed to be. Like an idiot, I decided to be clever and use the depth of the mortise to raise my table saw rather than just using the marks that I had made for the depth to cut the tenons. I compared the tenon to the mortise and it looked pretty good, so then I could adjust the table saw in order to cut off the shoulders. With the tenons complete, I could do a quick dry fit. Everything was nice and tight, and then I realized my mistake. So I took it over to the miter saw to fix it. A few of the joints were just a little bit tight, so I used some sandpaper to get them just right. And once everything was good, I was able to chop off the corners with the chisel to make the two tenons fit together. With the joints all dry fit together, I decided it was time to glue them together, and I completely forgot that I was going to taper the legs. So I applied liberal amounts of glue and put things together, squished it together with the clamp, and I used some small little cut-off blocks around the corners just to make sure everything was a 90-degree corner. The long rails were a bit tricky, so I ended up deciding that I would just go ahead and glue everything together all at once to make sure everything sort of fit together right, and then just clamp it and hope for the best. I flipped it over so that it would be more or less flat on top, and then I used some more of those blocks around the corners to try to help ensure all the angles would be 90 degrees. With the frame ready, I decided to focus a little bit on the bottle caps. So first I cleaned off the tabletop since it had gathered quite a bit of sawdust, and then I started applying the bottle caps, trying to figure out what I was going to do. I applied a bunch just to one side to get a feel for how many I would have on one side, and then I slowly built up a pattern that I thought would be good. If you squint very heavily and tilt your head 90 degrees to the left, you might just be able to figure out what I'm going for. Once I decided the pattern worked the way I wanted it to, I went ahead and filled up the rest of the top with bottle caps, and I started to glue them down with hot glue. I pretty quickly realized that this wasn't going to work because there's just so much space underneath the bottle cap, and I really didn't want to waste that much hot glue. So this is something like 400 bottle caps. So I decided that I would cut a 1/4-inch sheet of plywood into lots of little pieces that I could glue underneath. With those pieces hot glued to the bottom of each of the bottle caps, I could just use regular wood glue to glue them down to the actual surface. In theory, this seemed like a great idea. In reality, this was a very bad way of approaching this problem. After I had glued maybe half the bottle caps in place on the tabletop, I decided it'd be good to get back to the frame and go ahead and make sure it glued up okay. I sanded it down just to make sure everything was smooth and flush, and then I could put glue on the top of that and bring over the tabletop. In order to help hold the tabletop in place while the glue was setting, I took off a few bottle caps and put some brads in so that they would be covered. I finally realized that my mistake with the tenons meant that my top was a little bit longer than I needed it to be. So I cleared off some of the bottle caps and used a flush trim bit to flush out the top along two of the sides. Unfortunately, using the router on the tabletop meant that everything got covered in sawdust. So I tried to use the shop vac to clean it up. And then I discovered that plenty of the caps weren't glued down enough, so they got sucked into the shop vac, and I had to dig them out. At that point, I decided it'd probably be better to use a tack cloth to try to clean things up. Unfortunately, the tack cloth didn't clean up between the bottle caps well, so I went back to the shop vac and just accepted that some caps would be pulled up. But even that didn't work as well as I wanted it to. I decided I just needed to bite the bullet and pull off all the bottle caps, and that way I could get the surface clean, and then I would just glue them back on. So I used a heat gun to loosen up some of that hot glue so I could just pop off the bottle caps, and then for the most part I was able to just pull the little wooden pieces off with my fingers. Just a couple of them needed a chisel. After that frustration with the top, I decided I would focus on the legs for a little bit, and I finally realized that I did not taper them, but I decided I could just round them over and maybe it would look decent. After cleaning up the sawdust, I took this opportunity to go ahead and stain the bottom. It didn't have to look perfect, so I went pretty quickly. The top was looking a little bit rough because I had to sand it back down after taking off all those little wooden spacers, so I put another coat on that, and then I went ahead and stained the sides as well. After all of the things that had already gone wrong on this project, I ended up taking a couple of days away from it before I came back and found that the top stain had still not dried. For some reason, that second coat that I put on just never dried, so I tried pouring paint thinner on it and scrubbing it a little bit to see what that would do. That didn't do a whole lot, so I bit the bullet yet again and decided to sand the entire top down once more, and then I could go ahead and restain it. The next day it was time to start on the trim. I paused to warm up my fingers and then continued to look over the pieces of walnut I was planning to use. I decided to cut them 3 inches wide so that it would provide just enough trim around the edge without looking too thick or excessive to me. I noticed the barcode was still on one of the pieces, so I used the heat gun to heat up the adhesive and just pull that right off. One of the pieces was particularly warped as I checked the measurements. It was a good few millimeters out on one side if the other side was pressed in, but I really liked the way that it looked, so I decided that I would just try to enjoy life and work with this piece anyway. I set up the miter saw to cut the 45-degree angles at the end of each of the trim pieces, and once those were ready, then I started to glue up these little spacers, with the idea being I could use this to verify that the trim pieces were sticking up just the right amount all the way around the entire tabletop. To attach the trim, I applied an excessive amount of glue to the sides of the table, and then I used those little spacer pieces that I had made to make sure it was sticking up enough, and I used the nail gun to pop a couple of nails in place to hold it while the glue dried. Unfortunately, the nail gun gave me a little bit of trouble and didn't want to cooperate, so I had to finesse it a little bit. After letting the glue dry overnight, it was time to take off all the clamps and inspect the corners. One of the corners turned out great, a couple of them turned out okay, and one looked terrible.